What's up guys, Alex Louis here. Today we're going to talk about Angular data binding. And there's a couple points that I want to touch upon before I actually get into the code. So let's get started. So to understand data binding, you got to understand that there's different types of bindings that you can use. There's interpolation, property binding, event binding, class and style binding, and then lastly two-way binding. This video I'm going to show you the first two actually, the interpolation and property binding, and then I'll continue on with the rest of the videos with event and class, and then break them down. Actually, I'll break down to event binding, then class and style, and then two-way binding will be the last mini series in this whole binding series. What is interpolation? So interpolation involves using the double brackets, the double curly braces, to evaluate a template expression. And you're trying to evaluate a template expression from your component. And you're doing, now this interpolation involves one way. So you're going from the component to the UI. And with property binding, you're actually going to bind on the HTML element property. And I'll show you an example on how that works as well. Event binding has to do with binding the click events, mouse up, mouse down, keystroke up, keystroke down. Those are very important bindings that we need to cover as well. And class and style have to do with the CSS and the way that Angular, you can do it in Angular, where you can bind data and dynamic data to a class or a style and create your own styles based on some condition. And then two-way binding is exactly what it is it's going from component to UI and then UI back to component. So let's take a look at interpolation. Take a look at an example of that, which I have cooked up. Here I've created my sample binding class, which has 4 properties, one being an array. It has a str1 to define my greeting. And this is a name. My name's not Brendan, of course, you know that. str2 would say I like 2, and then I have a likes array that has my particular likes. Actually, we should change this to Alex. I shouldn't be using Brendan. Okay. Now, aside from the 4 properties that I've defined, I also have a function called getLikes. And we're actually going to call this function from the UI and pass it in the likes array, and that will actually give us a comma delimited string which will be shown on the front end. It'll be rendered on the front end, so it doesn't look like an object array. And I'm returning this back. And then this image source, again, I'm doing interpolation and binding it to the source property of the image tag. And I've put my file under my assets directory. Dot means you're going up 2 directories. Currently we're under the app directory, and if I did dot / that means I am in the current directory. So what I want to do is I want to go up 1 directory up to source, and then from source I want to go to assets, and then under assets I have my Angel's Landing JPEG, which is the image that I want to render as well. Now if we go to the sample binding HTML file, it's just a simple example of interpolation. And here I'm doing concatenation between str1 and name. And if you remember, str1 is the phrase that says hello, my name is. Then I concatenate to name. And then it's going to say hello, my name is Alex. This is another example of interpolation which I am binding the image src variable, which binds to my JPEG. And then str2 is I like to, and I'm calling the function directly on the expression itself. Now this is going to, so if I'm going to save all this, save that, and this is what you should see when you are actually rendering this HTML page. It's going to say, hello, my name is Alex, this is my image, and then that's the phrase below that I put on the HTML page. The difference between, well, one difference I'm going to talk about is between interpolation and property binding is that one is you can concatenate strings using interpolation. So as you see here, I'm concatenating two strings together and I'm able to render that text. If I was using property binding, I could not concatenate two strings together. So for example, I'm going to actually change this code to use property binding. So I'm going to use property binding on image source, and I'm going to do this. So if we look at these two ways to do it, there's really not much difference except the source property of image will have these open brackets and close bracket, which is Angular's way of saying, okay, you're doing property binding. And then the other difference is since we're not using interpolation anymore, we're going to actually just pass in the straight up property name within my HTML file. So image source would evaluate to this particular value. And now as I save this file, if I do that, there's really nothing that changes. Now, here is where it is going to change. And let me show you another quick example. What I've done here is I've added two buttons. I've added something called a try me button. And if we look at the code, one is using property binding and the other one is using interpolation. The difference right now is really not much, because if I go back to my, so what I've added another property called isDisabled. So we go back to the TypeScript. It's a Boolean property, and right now it's set to true, which means that when I set the button property to true, to set the button property of disable to true, that means that this button will be disabled and this button would be disabled, which is exactly what we get. Okay. Now watch when I set the actual property to false. So watch what's going to happen. Let's go back, and I'm going to set this to false, which is a Boolean value, and I'm going to save all. Now, just to go back to the code, that means that my button here for line 5, disabled, is false, which means this button should not be disabled, it should be enabled. And you would think that in the interpolation example that actually would be true as well, where this button would be enabled. Now if we go back to our project, you're gonna see, I'm gonna zoom in here for a second, that the first one is enabled, but then the second button using the interpolation is not. And that is another major difference between interpolation and property binding. When you're trying to evaluate an expression that involves a Boolean type or anything other than a string, it's actually not going to work if you use interpolation. This is just going to evaluate this to a string, and it really doesn't care. It's still going to be disabled. Okay, but if you use property binding, then you have now a Boolean type which will evaluate with the expected outcome of the property. So best practice is if you're trying to, so if you're dealing with checkboxes or radio buttons, then you want to try to stick to property binding and their Boolean properties, obviously. If you're just trying to render strings in a particular HTML element or just on the actual page, then you can stick to interpolation. But if you're, but again, with the radio buttons and checkboxes, can't do it with interpolation. You'd have to use property binding. And then, as I mentioned, with property binding, can't really concatenate a anything under. You can't concatenate any strings. So if I'm trying to do any type of other property binding, and I'm concatenating, for example, if I was trying to concatenate the source where I had a directory and then file name, I can't do that. I can't do that. I have to use interpolation. So it works here because, again, this is a string type that's it's being expected. But once you get to the Booleans, it's not really going to work. And then if you're trying to concatenate, this will not, you won't allow you to do that on the property binding. But again, they're pretty interchangeable. In many cases, it is possible to use interpolation to achieve the same results you get with property binding. But for the most part, again, I always use my checkbox or radio buttons examples. You want to use property binding with those because they are Boolean. And then anything else, yeah, you can stick to interpolation. Okay, I hope you've learned a bit on just the first building blocks of data binding. Subscribe to my channel if you can. Never any ads. I'll see you on the next video.